all of us. I need to give a special thanks out to several of the contributors to this presentation. Kim Overton Spahos, who is actually with the North Carolina District Attorneys Association. I had the pleasure of seeing her present live a couple of weeks ago, and she is phenomenal. And Teresa Stafford, who is the Chief Advocacy Officer for the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. And so a lot of the work and the research that I've done in this area is around sexual violence. And because that's the area that I've spent a lot of my time in the world of prosecution and currently in the role that I'm in now, in educating others about how to successfully and what success should look like when prosecuting sexual violence and domestic violence cases. So that's the space that I came from. But I have to say, we all have bias. This is why this is important to everybody. I don't care what area of work that you're in, we all have biases. And we'll talk about explicit and implicit biases, but I can tell you that I definitely have a bias towards the Gators. I know it might be a little too soon for us to talk about this right now based off of what happened this past weekend, but I love my Gators. And then I like to think of myself as a dog person. I feel like, oh yeah, I love dogs. I have 2 huge dogs, Great Danes. And I came to understand that implicitly, which is now because of my self-awareness, that implicitly I didn't really like little dogs. They just not my thing. And I know this is a very controversial topic because I know the little dog team is very strong and very vocal. And I don't mean to offend anybody, but I just had to come and notice that I had a bias against little dogs. And so when I say this, that we all have biases, it is something that is, again, within each of us. But what we're talking about today is how do we define these terms? How do we define, we have bias as the umbrella, and we know that there's both implicit and explicit bias, and the way that those implicit and explicit biases come out can be in a lot of different ways, whether it be through white privilege, microaggression, and macroaggression. And before people stop watching, please let us come up with a common definition, a common core term, because I really think that the most important thing for us to have a dialogue is for us to operate on similar terminology, for us to understand what we mean when we say certain things versus assuming and presuming things that are being said. So let's break these down just a little bit. When we talk about implicit versus explicit bias, so when we talk about implicit, these are things that are outside of our consciousness. I mean, we're not even aware that they are happening, which is why, and all of us have them, which is why we have to be very deliberate and intentional to figure out what they are. Because the reality is that they affect our perceptions and our actions, how we interact with others. And what's really interesting about implicit bias is that a lot of times it doesn't necessarily align with our declared beliefs, with what we tell people we think or what we think we think. And so that's why they could be really kind of sneaky in how they come out and how they are perceived. The other part is the explicit bias. This is the easy part, right? If you think about me and my love for Gators, I am not shy about it. I will push it out there. But that's something that's more, okay, understandably here, maybe not so friendly, but it's something that can be extremely dangerous, obviously. And sometimes that's what we focus on when we think of bias within our system, stereotypes, when we think of racism, all the isms, we kind of sometimes exist at that explicit bias because it's easy to see. It's recognized on that conscious level. You're aware of the fact that you have this bias. And when people feel they're threatened, they're really more likely to draw boundaries to distinguish themselves. And so that's when we see a lot of explicit bias that takes place. And again, it's having that self-awareness. It's asking yourself the why that those exist. And for implicit bias, it's asking the additional question of the what. So like I said, even people with deeply held conscious beliefs that all people should be treated fairly, regardless of race, they still have implicit bias. So that means that we have got to have this conversation and we've got to have the self-awareness. So the other terms you heard me talk about were macroaggression and microaggression. And you might hear about these a lot of times about individuals who experience microaggression. So when you talk about a microaggression, is more like individual one-on-one interactions that can be offensive to the other person. And it could be that implicit bias where you're not even meaning for it to be offensive, but the way that it is received by the person who is hearing it, that could be particularly offensive. And so it's those microaggressions. And then the macroaggressions are more the systemic structural level. It's the policies and practices that are in place, or even a lack of response or access or accountability within a system. So it's a more systemic level when you're talking about the macroaggressions. So let's give some examples for microaggression, right? A type of microaggression that comes to, say, class is somebody might say something like, that's ghetto. So what the message that is portrayed is that poverty is associated with negative, undesirable characteristics. Or for gender, for example, a female chief financial officer receives an email that addresses her as sir. That is giving the perception that microaggression, that micro messaging that's coming through is that it's unlikely for a female to have a position associated with math, something along those lines within this type of organization. For sexual orientation, it could sound like, I like you, but why do others have to shove it in our faces? And that goes to say that the messaging that comes across is that the LGBTQ experience is offensive and abnormal. And so when we're talking about these statements that are well intended, a lot of times they can pack a real sting to those that are hearing it. I have a coworker who explains it very, very adequately, as in death by 1,000 bee stings, right? It's just these constant little attacks at who you are and taking away from that and undermining that and demeaning that. All right. This is definitely a triggering word for a lot of people to hear the terminology white privilege. And so when we talk about what white privilege is, by no means does it disassociate the fact that people along all racial groups experience some really tough circumstances and some really, quite honestly, horrific circumstances within their own homes. And I can testify to this because I work with groups of all races as a prosecutor when I was prosecuting, and fully recognize the fact that some folks have got some really bad circumstances going on. That is not what white privilege has to do with. What white privilege is talking about is not what goes on inside your home, but it talks about your encounter and the experience that you have when you're outside of the home. So, for example, I have benefited from white privilege, even though only about 50%, I did the spit test and all that kind of stuff. Only 50% of my ethnicity comes from European countries. But my appearance, I can appear to be white. And so I know that when there are situations where maybe I walk into a store or walk into an establishment, the response that I may receive, and then say my husband or my children walk in behind me who are definitely of a different hue, definitely have darker skin, and the response that they receive when they enter upon a place. And I'm not saying this happens every single place that we go, but the fact that it does happen is an assertion and an example of what white privilege is. And so white privilege is the societal privilege that benefits white people over non-white people. It is that presumption that there is no negative association with that individual that comes in, whereas non-whites oftentimes experience those stereotypes and those presumptions and those prejudices when they enter a place. And so we know that's a lot of times how this is manifested. And so what am I talking about at the macro level? So we said, remember, macro level is those social constructs, those systemic type things. What does it look like? So this is an example of a macroaggression. This was along the times where the hurricane hit Louisiana, which one, right? Because unfortunately they get slammed with these hurricanes. But this is from several years back. And when you see two different groups of people doing the same conduct, the labeling by the media. So you have a Black male who is going and getting food and things along those lines, and he's described as looting. Where you see two white appearing individuals who are doing the same thing, getting food from a local grocery store, they are labeled as finding. So that is an example of a macroaggression, of the nefarious intent associated with a non-white appearing individual versus the benefit of the doubt for the white appearing individuals. Another example in this two news articles. One is a white defendant who is charged with stabbing another child who is 14, and then another one who is in some type of interaction with other individuals. So the black male is labeled as the thug and the white offender is labeled as the teen. So again, this is at the macro level because you're talking about systems of the media. Criminal justice response. We definitely are not immune from these biases and from these macroaggressions. And this is not something that, is just lightly talked about. These are statistics. There is a lot of research out there that goes to show the disparate impact that the criminal justice system has had on communities of color. And so we have to be cognizant of that because we have the responsibility to fix that. And one current example that we can look at is the criminal justice's response to opioids versus crack cocaine. And we looked at what's the big difference between opioids and crack cocaine. Well, there can be several, but one of the major differences is the end user and who is most impacted by the use of each of these different forms of substances. And so how we responded, because I was prosecuting right when, not at the height of the crack epidemic, but definitely when it was still prevalent and still prolific. And the response that we had was definitely not for services. It definitely was not for rehabilitation. It definitely was not for treatment. But now when we talk about the opioid problem, a lot of times we see that that is the exact response that we want to have to how do we work our way out of the opioid crisis. And all the point is that we need to have that equity moving forward, that if we're going to treat one drug one way, we should treat all the drugs that way for the users that are having an addiction with those different substances. And so what we need to do is, I know I'm not just going to sit here and talk to you about all the problems. There are solutions, right? There are solutions out there. And so what we have to do is we have to have a culture shift, period, point blank. We have got to have self-assessment and we've got to have our situational assessment and looking outside of ourselves. And so I talked about how that implicit bias is really kind of sneaky. It's the one that you don't really know is in existence, the one that you don't know is there. And so sometimes we have to be able to have some type of evaluation of ourselves. And luckily there are tools that are out there. I'm not endorsing either of these tools, but just more to bring awareness. And I'm sure there are plenty of others that are out there just to let you know that these tools exist so that you can utilize them to figure out, okay, where are my implicit biases? Where are these different things that are happening? Another thing that we have to do is we cannot assert that we are colorblind. As an aside, if you do not see the question mark in the middle of this circle, perhaps a visit to the optometrist may be worth your while, because I think that this is actually engaged to people who are technically colorblind. And so we as a society do not want to be colorblind, because what makes us great is the fact that we bring so many different perspectives to the table, and we should appreciate those, and we should want to learn about each other's differences, because that, in having this vast diaspora of experiences and of cultures and of everything that comes along with the great differences that we have, because we always kind of look at differences as a negative, our differences are what makes us strong. And so that's what we need to do, is stop saying, well, I'm colorblind, because what that tells a person when you say, well, I don't see color, is that you don't see them, because their ethnicity, their culture, their heritage is part of them. And when you say, I don't see that, then that's a microaggression, number one. But number two, it's disheartening. It's like saying, I refuse to see who you are. And nobody wants to feel that way. And so what we don't want to strive for is cultural competency. We don't want to strive for cultural competency. You might be like, what? For years we've heard we got to be culturally competent. So the terminology is changing, and for good reason. So we want to be cultural humility, practice cultural humility and cultural responsiveness. So when we talk about cultural humility, why do we want to embrace that versus competency? Because competency means, oh, well, I've learned about that culture. I'm good. I don't need to learn anything else. Whereas cultural humility is an ongoing process. You're continually growing. You're humble enough to know that we will never fully understand and fully learn a culture outside of our own, and that it is an ongoing process, like I said earlier. And so it really recognizes and affirms the values and worths of individuals, families, and community, and really preserves that dignity to say, we are on a path. This is not a finite trip. We are continuously on this path walking together. And then when we talk about cultural responsiveness, it's the ability to learn and relate respectfully with people of your own culture as well as those from other cultures, right? Sometimes we got to stop talking and start listening. It's one of our biggest flaws that we have as a society. Everybody is on their soapbox and we are telling people what they need to do and how it should be and this, that, and the other. And I'm even guilty of that at times. But sometimes through the cultural responsiveness is we just got to know when to be quiet and listen as well. We've got to find that balance. And when we find that balance, we appreciate the things that are great about our own culture, and we share that with others, and we want to truly learn and accept and receive from other cultures. That's when we're culturally responsive. That's when we're being culturally showing and practicing cultural humility. So I love this cartoon, which says, why don't we have any fresh ideas around here? And of course, everybody looks the same. This is a real, it's a very, I think, accurate reality for a lot of us is that we live in our own echo chambers, right? We tend to go and gravitate to people who are like us in however we define what is us, whether it be professionally, like maybe you're an IT professional and you find people like me who, have to call once a year to be like, my charger's not working, that you find us off-putting. So you're like, I want to hang out with my IT folks. Maybe it aligns along cultural and ethnic lines. Maybe it align football teams, whatever it may be. A lot of times we tend to group within our own echo chambers. And while that can be comforting, and while I'm not saying you should not do that, of course you should do that because that's where you find your comfort, that's where you find your camaraderie. We also have to be conscious to balance that and get outside of our echo chamber and make sure that we're having these diverse perspectives come into our lives and feeding into who we are so that we can grow individually. And so how do we get out and depower these biases? Well, we have to have improved decision-making. We have to counter stereotypic imaging. We have to individuate, and we have to have that intergroup contact, that reaching out, that understanding others, understanding these individuals that are not like how we define us, right? We got to get out of the us mentality and understand that there's other groups out there. And so when it comes to identity and intersectionality, like think about this. There's a lot of things that you individually, if you were to say, who am I? And it might be, so for me, I'm a mother and I'm a wife and I'm a lawyer and soon to be a district attorney and I'm a friend and I'm a sister and I'm a dog owner, and I can list and list and list. And then I get into historical, right? I am third generation law enforcement. I also have several military veterans within my family. But I also have the experiences and the upbringing. So I also have the historical experience of being first generation in this country, and also have the experience of being daughters of the American Revolution qualified. And so you can see, this is just a really brief example, but you can see that we have a lot of intersectionality as to who we are and who shapes who we are. And in understanding how complex we are as an individual, when you're looking at that man in the mirror, you're looking at yourself and saying, man, I got a lot that feeds into who I am. We have got to do that same projection when it comes to individuating others, right? We have to understand that who we are, we bring a lot of different pieces to the table, whether it could be your race, ethnicity, it could be if there's substance abuse, it could be if there's differing abilities, it could be if there's criminal history, mental health. These are all things that oftentimes, looking in these different categories, that we can find biases in. But if we look at it, we can also see that we exist in a lot of these circles, in a lot of these frames of reference, that we know people that exist in a lot of these frames of reference, to make that individuating easier, to say that everybody has these intersectionalities. And so making it about that individual, making it so that it's somebody that you can connect with, that you can find that common ground. You have to make fairness a personal goal, right? You have to say, when you're interacting and off that visceral response of seeing somebody, like, am I being fair? Am I, how am I dealing with interacting with this individual? We have to educate ourselves. Again, get out of the echo chamber. We have to have those diverse perspectives. We have to think counter stereotypically. So if you look at somebody and you think that stereotype, for example, if you look at gators and you think hate, just think about the fact of, man, And Sarah and I were talking about this before the show. Man, I bet those Gators had to go through a bunch of hurricanes. And I know we just had to go through a tropical storm here. I bet that's a tough experience to have to go through that all the time. So you're countering the stereotype of just, oh, I dislike them to, man, we got something in common. So when you're thinking along those things, taking that implicit bias test, really just kind of slowing down, because oftentimes that implicit bias can become explicit bias. Sometimes when we're in high stress situations. So making sure to just slow down and just kind of decompress. Reversing parties is a really good strategy as well, of looking at an individual and reversing and saying, well, what if they looked like me? And having those different kind of conversations, and would I still feel this way that I'm having? And these are a lot of times internal conversations. Thinking about how you think, getting honest feedback. Sometimes it's about finding and creating that safe space for those uncomfortable conversations. Nobody wants to talk about this type of stuff because it can be really uncomfortable. I shouldn't say nobody, some of us do. But it is uncomfortable, and we have to respect the fact that it's uncomfortable, but still create a space where we can have really honest conversations to move the needle and push the needle forward. And the most important thing I could say is this is a learning experience. This is a process. It is ongoing. It does not end. So it's not like a one and done that you check off the box and you're like, hey, I'm good to go. So when we talk about putting cultural humility into practice, 4 key factors. We have to show respect. We have to communicate. We have to strive to understand, and we have to engage. And I say that to go into it humbly, because the best way to really approach the situation is to say, I don't understand. I would like to learn more. And can you help me learn more? While also being conscious and cognizant that you're not putting it on the people that have been oppressed to be the ones that are in charge of the education piece as well. But to also show that you are open to having those conversations could be really huge and be a change maker in the conversation getting started. So this is a really quick presentation, just hitting kind of some of the highlights. This could go on literally for days, months, years, because like I said, it is a process. But I really want to say thank you for your engagement. Thank you for being here to listen to me. I appreciate your time. And Sarah, I want to turn it back over to you in case there are any questions or anything that we have coming up.
Sorry, I was muted. I don't even know where to start with all that. I mean, number one, I will say, jokingly, like, you're very lucky that the Gators won, or you would have had to have redacted your power. I mean, you can still be a loyal Gators fan, but still,
I'm always a win or lose. I am always there for them. It just probably would not have stung as much to my
yeah. Oh, God, man, it does sting a little. Anyway, all jokes aside, I just think that was some incredible information, and a lot of it, I feel like it just boils down to, I would say, one, thinking before you speak, right? Being humble enough to ask questions and own that you don't know everything, which I feel like that's the hardest obstacle that people face, and being able to listen. It's not easy. A lot of people, and I mean, self-proclaimed, like, I always like to be right, but that doesn't mean I am always right. But I think by opening the doors to have those conversations ultimately is one of the most essential things that people can do.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes. Okay. So I have a question for you. One of the questions I have was, you talked a lot about implicit bias and how it's a little bit harder to navigate and kind of know when you're going there. So how, and I'm thinking from the lens of the business community. So with businesses or organizations, what are ways that they can identify implicit bias?
Yeah. So outside of the test that we were talking about during the presentation, I think that some really good things would be, number one, as a business, looking at the materials, right? What are the materials that you put out to the community to advertise your services, to advertise or market whatever it is that you have to offer? And do those materials reflect the community that you serve? Because a form of implicit bias could be that you're walking into an establishment that doesn't reflect the people that you are actually intending to serve. So that's one way to do it. I also think that creating that office culture where it's a safe space, where it's somewhere that if you do ask that question that kind of just doesn't hit right, that is awkward, that maybe in all honesty is offensive, that you've created a safe space where somebody can come back to you through whatever avenues there are to say, hey, I'm sure you didn't mean it. However, I wanted to let you know this is how I felt when you said this, so that you're creating that environment to nurture and grow and allow for those really, again, uncomfortable conversations to take place.
Perfect. Well, and I mean, that kind of goes into my next question, and you brought it up in an excellent way. I personally deal with a whole variety of different people, different businesses, different walks of life. And I just remember when the murders of like Breonna Taylor and others came to fruition back during the summer, I remember being a little shell-shocked that I had close personal friends of mine who were of a different race, Blacks, that were having emotions, and we had very honest, genuine conversations around it. And it was a weird space to be in, because I was sitting there, honestly thinking like, these are friends of mine. We go have drink, we'll go have wine together. And there was this whole other layer that we had never gone there with one another. And it wasn't, it was very civil. It was very open. It was very honest. But I just know that was such an experience for me. It was a wonderful one. I mean, we were all in tears. We were all hugging. It wasn't anything bad. We were just able to kind of have conversations about things that I never knew were concerns for them, and vice versa. So as people, in using that as an example, how can others approach having conversations with people of another color in a way that, I know we talked about this a little bit, but like in a way that makes it go well for everyone?
Yeah. I think that a really great way could be to just, again, going into it humbly, right? Saying, look, I don't understand what's going on as much as you do, but I see that you're really hurt. I see that this is really impacting you. And I want to understand that, because as a friend, I care about you and I want to understand. And again, it's just that humility of talking and saying, like, I don't get it and I want to get it.
Yeah.
And then the other part is like the reversing piece, right? If this is something that, I've seen several videos where they kind of do this and reflect, like, if these roles were reversed, what would society look like? And I feel like that's a really powerful demonstrative aid visually to see. But sometimes, it does hit hard, and it makes individuals feel like, where is the allyship, right? Where are those that don't look like me, but want to stand up for people that look like me? Because this is an atrocity. This is a societal ill. And I need to feel supported in my close circles. And just like you would for any other friend, to be like, how can I support you? What can I do? And just sometimes offering that safe space, and also just standing there in support and solidarity as well, I think can be very important. Sometimes just the silent support can also be powerful.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, I just remember one of the examples that I had seen, I forget, it was on the news or somewhere, was the phrase, I don't see color. And a lot of people, I would say predominantly Caucasians, say that, and they think that that's a good thing. Right. And then all of this news and information came out to where the African-American community is like, or others, are like, absolutely not. Like, we want you to see our color. We want to celebrate that. And that was just, even just that was just an eye-opening moment. I'm just thinking of different kind of situations, but I love your words. Help me understand. Like, it can just be that simple. It's that, and just be prepared for what comes with the helping understand. So
absolutely.
I think it's wonderful. This has been great. I hate to cut us off, but I know we both have, we've all got other things to do. Go out and save the world. Put your cape on. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. It's always a pleasure. You're so intelligent. Like, you're just so smart, and I'm so excited to see.
Sarah, thank you for keeping the bar low. I love you.
You've already done amazing things in our community. I can't wait to see where you go from now. So, and this doesn't stop this conversation. Again, we're just kind of starting to put this information out there for, residents, businesses, other organizations. We've got a bunch of different things that are getting lined up for 2021 and beyond, because, as on behalf of the chamber, like, we absolutely see how essential and important that having these conversations and putting the information out there. It's not easy to just, we were talking about that before we went live. We're like, all right, well, there's no telling what's going to happen, but I think that, putting your toe in the water a little bit at a time and saying, help me understand is going to get us going in the right direction. So
completely agree. And thank you guys so much for taking on this really, really important topic, especially for the chamber. I think that is huge. And I really, really appreciate you guys for doing that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Dahlia. Again, we'll make sure and put all of this information up on our website. I'm pretty sure we'll have you back on again at some point. So everyone, just have a great rest of your afternoon. And Dahlia, thank you once again.
Thank you guys. Have a great one.
Bye.